So as I've pointed out many times, the Romans who sacked Jerusalem, the Romans who killed the Messiah. I know the Romanish Christians today. Oh, it was the Jews. It was the Jews. I want to show you a couple of things. I'm going to try to make this as uncomplicated as I can, but I have to search out different passages of people's studies and so on and so forth to get to what I'm trying to talk about today. There were 4 legions, at least 4 legions, who participated in the destruction of Jerusalem. One was the 10th Legion. And please, folks, do not forget, those of you who have listened to my videos know by now that I claim that the number of the beast, or the number emblem, is a number. It is in the form of the Roman numeral 10. And unfortunately, the Christians, after the sack of Jerusalem, had eventually adopted that number as their emblem. All right. So I'm going to go into the fact that the soldiers of the 10th Legion, they were the ones who killed. They divided up his clothes. They put the crown of thorns on his head. They mocked him. They ridiculed him. Let me see. If I can go to Psalm 22 real quick and see if I can find a Psalm of David. All right. Let's start in verse 10. I was cast upon you from the womb, for you are my Elohim from my mother's belly. Folks, I don't care what anybody says. I don't care what the preacher tells you. That's when it began for him. Verse 11, be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you have brought me into the dust of the death. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Be not far from me, O Jehovah. O my strength, haste thee to help me. Now, obviously, David is prophesying concerning the son of David. Who was David pointing the finger at? The Romans. But in this particular case, it wasn't just The Romans, it was a particular Roman legion. The one whose emblem was the Roman numeral 10. That one. And during the time of Yeshua Messiah, they occupied the Mount of Olives, East Jerusalem. Now you begin to understand why that utter hatred for the emblem, Roman numeral 10, is within the powers of heaven. Now, I'm going to go to the siege of Jerusalem. Well, actually, I'm going to do this first. On unitedwithisrael.org, a rare coin dating to the 1st century, minted during the 4th year of the Great Jewish Revolt against the Romans, was recently discovered at the archaeological sifting project at Emet Zerim National Park in Jerusalem. The source of the soil from which the coin was extracted is the City of David National Park in the heart of the Old City, East Jerusalem. The coin minted by Jews in the year 69 CE, or as the non-Jews would say, 69 AD, right before the destruction of the Second Temple a year later, that's right, 70 AD or 70 CE, featured the words, "For the redemption of Zion," in ancient Hebrew script with an image of a goblet under the inscription. Now, it is interesting to me, and these folks find it interesting too, that it was found, this coin was found just recently. Redemption. So what was going on? What was happening? The siege of Jerusalem. '70 CE or 70 AD was, on Wikipedia, was the decisive event of the First Jewish-Roman War. The Roman army, led by the future Emperor Titus, with Tiberius Julius Alexander as his second in command, besieged and conquered the city of Jerusalem, which had been controlled by Judean rebel factions since 66 CE. Following the Jewish riots, or Jerusalem riots of 66, when the Judean Free Government was formed in Jerusalem, the siege ended in August the 30th, 70 CE, with the burning and destruction of the Second Temple, and the Romans entered and sacked the lower city. The destruction of both the First and Second Temples is still mourned annually as the Jewish fast Tishba B'Av. The Arch of Titus, celebrating the Roman sack of Jerusalem and the Temple, still stands in Rome today. The conquest of the city was complete on September 8th, 70 CE, and I have pointed this out many times when I discussed Daniel 9 and how every single one of the preachers have perverted, have distorted Daniel 9 to claim that the destruction of Jerusalem is yet to come. So the siege, despite early successes in repelling Roman sieges, the zealots fought amongst themselves, and they lacked proper leadership, resulting in poor discipline, training, and preparation for battles that were to follow. At one point, they destroyed the food stocks in the city, a drastic measure thought to have been undertaken, perhaps in order to enlist a merciful Elohim's intervention on behalf of the besieged Jews, or as a stratagem to make the defenders more desperate, supposing that was necessary in order to repel the Roman army. Titus began his siege a few days before Passover, surrounding the city with 3 legions: the 5th Legion, Macedonia; the 12th Legion, Fulminata; the 15th Legion, the Apollyon Legion, yes, Apollinaris, and all those were on the western side. But which legion was on the eastern side? The most holy place, where the Mount of Olives was. It was the 10th Legion, the number 10, the Roman numeral 10, that number that the Christians adopted for themselves. On the Mount of Olives to the east, it says. If the reference in his Jewish war at, 6.421 is to Titus's siege, though difficulties exist with its interpretation, then at the time, according to Josephus, Jerusalem was thronged with many people who had come to celebrate the Passover. I want to stop right here for just a second. And I want to point something out in the Bible. Zechariah 14, verse 4 first. This is talking about Jehovah. On that day, what day? On the day that they try to do this again. When the Gentiles tried to take Jerusalem again. If you read the whole, this is the whole, if you read the whole of the chapter, you realize this is the day when they're going to take East Jerusalem away from Israel. But for a moment. And what is going to happen as a result? He's going to stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. And on the Mount of Olives will be split in two, from the east to the west, forming a great valley. Okay. Now, what's so special about the Mount of Olives? Mark 3. Mark 13, verse 3. Start in verse 1. And when he had went out of the temple, one of his disciples said unto him, Master, do you see what manner of stones and what buildings are here? And Yeshua answered and said unto him, do you see all these great buildings? There shall not a single one stone be left on another, and they shall all be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, or against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us when these things shall be, and when shall the sign of these things be fulfilled? Now, what sits on the opposite side, or just across the way from the Mount of Olives? The temple. Let's go back to the siege. The thrust of the siege began in the west at the third wall, north of the Jaffa Gate. By May, this was breached, and the second wall also was taken shortly thereafter, leaving the defenders in possession of the temple and the upper and lower city. The Jewish defenders were split in factions. John of Gischala's group murdered another faction leader, Eleazar ben Simon, whose men were entrenched in the forecourts of the temple. The enmities between John of Gischala and Simon bar Giora were papered over only when the Roman siege engineers began to erect ramparts. Titus then had a wall built to girdle the city in order to starve out the population more effectively. After several failed attempts to breach or scale the walls of the fortress of Antonia, the Romans finally launched a secret attack, overwhelming the sleeping zealots and taking the fortress by late July. After Jewish allies killed a number of Roman soldiers, Titus sent Josephus, the Jewish historian, to negotiate with the defenders. This ended with the Jews wounding the negotiator with an arrow, and another sally was launched shortly thereafter. Titus was almost captured during this sudden attack, but escaped. Overlooking the temple compound, the fortress provided a perfect point from which to attack the temple itself. Battering rams made little progress, but the fighting itself eventually set the walls on fire. A Roman soldier threw a burning stick onto one of the temple's walls. Destroying the temple was not among Titus's goals, as I've mentioned many times before. In fact, Titus did not want the temple destroyed, and he made the soldiers, he made his legions sign a pact, a covenant, not to destroy the temple. Destroying the temple was not among Titus's goals, possibly due in part to massive expansions done by Herod the Great. Mere decades earlier, Titus had wanted to seize it and transform it into a temple dedicated to the Roman emperor and the Roman pantheon, you see. How many times have I mentioned this? However, the fire quickly spread and was soon out of control. The temple was captured and destroyed. On the 10th Tisha B'Av, at the end of August, and the flames spread into the residential sections of the city. Josephus described the scene. As the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. Passion alone was in command. Crowded together around the entrances were many trampled by their friends. Many fell upon the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as the defeated. As they neared the sanctuary, they pretended not to hear Caesar's commands and urged the men in front to throw on more firebrands. Caesar's commands? What were his commands? Don't destroy the temple! The partisans were no longer in position to help. Everywhere was slaughter and fight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar and the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. Josephus' account absolves... No, it doesn't. But I will continue. Absolves Titus of any culpability for the destruction of the temple. No, it is not. Just like they've tried to absolve all the kings at the Vatican for all the murders of the Jews. Just like they tried to absolve the one that Hitler and Mussolini hoisted up. They try to absolve him. Oh, no, he cannot be absolved. And neither can Titus be absolved either. I will continue. Of any culpability for the destruction of the temple, but this may merely reflect his desire to procure favor with the Flavian dynasty. The Roman legions quickly crushed the remaining Jewish resistance. Some of the remaining Jews escaped through the hidden underground tunnels and sewers, etc. Josephus claims that 1.1 million people were killed during the siege, in which a major were Jewish. Josephus attributes this to the celebration of Passover, which he uses as a rationale for the vast number of people present among the death toll. Armed rebels, as well as frail citizens, were put to death. All of Jerusalem's remaining citizens became Roman prisoners. After the Romans killed the armed and the elder people, 97,000 were still enslaved, including Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala. Simon Bar Giora was executed, and John of Giscala was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of the 97,000, thousands were forced to become gladiators and eventually expired in the arena. Many others were forced to assist in the building of the Forum of Peace and the Colosseum. Those under 17 years of age were sold into servitude. Josephus' death toll assumptions are rejected as impossible by modern scholarship, since around the time about 1 million people lived in Palestine, and half of them were Jews, and a sizable Jewish population remaining in the area after the war was over, even the hard-hit region of Judea. Titus and his soldiers celebrated victory upon their return to Rome by parading the menorah, the table of bread of Jehovah's presence, through the streets. Up until this parading, these items had only ever been seen by the high priest in the temple. This event was memorialized in the Arch of Titus, which, again, the Arch of Titus is still in Rome today. Many Jews fled to areas around the Mediterranean. And of course, as FTDNA and GDmatch.com has pointed out to me, much of my ancestry was all around the Mediterranean Sea. According to Philostratus, writing in the early years of the 3rd century, Titus reportedly refused to accept the wreath of victory, saying that the victory did not come through his own efforts, but that he had merely been a servant, merely served as an instrument of God's wrath. One thing that I also wanted to mention was it was at this point that the Christians had started to disassociate themselves with the Jews, because, you see, the religion of the apostles, and as I pointed out before, do not confuse the religion of the apostles with Christianity. It was considered a sect of the Jews. Prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Jews of the Roman province of Judea were divided into several movements, sometimes warring against themselves. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and Christians. And Christian was a name that was placed on the followers of Yeshua Messiah and the apostles by the Syrians at Antioch. It was not a name that they put upon themselves. They were Jews. That's what they were. They were of the 5 Jewish sects. They were Jews. That's why Paul mentions he is a Jew who is one inwardly. You see. But what happened was after the sack of Rome, the Christians began to disassociate themselves from the Jews. They did not want to be called Jews anymore, you see, out of fear of persecution. And when it was all said and done, how do I put this? Eventually, after years, after believers have died, new generations of Gentile Christians rose up and became enemies of the Jews. And it began before Constantine. But Constantine was the stamp, was the marker. And so, as I said, the Christians adopted the emblem of the most hated legion of the Romans. And if you think, let me go to a passage, and hopefully this will help everyone understand the hatred and the vengeance that is going to be put on the Romans. All the legions of the Romans, but especially on the ones who wear that number, or who. You see where I'm going with this? The Roman numeral 10 is the number of the Christians today. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you adopt that number? Matthew 23, verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Let me see. I think I'll go to Luke 13. I think it might be better. It doesn't. I don't see that. He was weeping over Jerusalem. Let me find this. Because he knew exactly what was going to happen. Oh, that's what I'm looking for. It's Luke 19:41. And he came near and beheld the city, because he knew what was going to happen to it, and wept over it. Was there joy in his heart for the destruction of Jerusalem? No. That was his city. and he wept over it. It hurt him down to his bones, knowing what was going to happen to Jerusalem. Saying, if you had known, even you, at least in this day, the things which belong unto your peace, but now they are hid from your eyes. For the day shall come upon you that your enemies shall cast a bank about you, and surround you, and hem you in on every side, and shall lay you even with the ground and your children within you, and they shall not leave in you one stone upon another, because you knew not the time of your visitation. Yes, he wept over the temple. You think he's forgotten what's happened to the temple? You think he forgot what happened? You think he forgot what the Romans did to his people? Now, here we are. You see what it says right here? Because you knew not the time of your visitation. Well, let me tell you something. The visitation upon the iniquities of the Roman Gentiles is coming as well. Now, he was talking about the visitation of himself to Israel, to Jerusalem. Now, for those of you who go around all the time perverting Daniel 9, talking about the Antichrist must come and he's going to make a covenant of peace with Israel, and that is the one to oppose, you absolutely have no idea the time of Messiah's visitation. You'll get it wrong. You'll get it backwards. And it will happen to you what happened to the Jews in Jerusalem in those days. What happened to Jerusalem is going to happen to Rome. But not just Rome. All of the cities of this world. All of them. Especially Western civilization. No, he hasn't forgotten. And don't wear that number 10 in any way, shape, or form. Not in 2D and not in 3D. Don't do it. It is a mark of a curse. It is a mark of Cain. And it is a mark of destruction.